Well, good evening to all of you. We're in week 7 of our survey. We've covered the first 500 years of both the new millennium and then also the history of the church. Now we're moving into the Middle Ages. Um, Interesting smorgasbord of different topics and things of content that some people think are great, like me. Some people think are garbage, like people in the Enlightenment who gave us the term the Dark Ages. But what really were these? So, the Middle Ages, which were also known as the Dark Ages, or the medieval period, if you want to get technical with it, traditionally stretch from the late 400s to the late 1400s, which is roughly 1,000 years of history or so. And if you don't put a whole lot of thought into it, it's easy for many people to look at the Middle Ages as some sort of long footnote in between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and then the Protestant Reformation. Um, or you could go, as I said, with the thinkers of the Enlightenment and call it the Dark Ages, a time of ignorance or blind faith where people did crazy things or what have you. And both of these approaches are wildly wrong for so many reasons. If for no other reason than because it's 1,000 years of history. Something of significance is bound to happen in any 1,000-year block of time. So, as we move through the Middle Ages, sort of from beginning to end, there's three primary things for us to note, both about the church, but then also the political situation throughout the entire millennium that we're looking at. First of all, as the church continues to deepen its ties with the state, and as the Western Church continues to become more and more like the modern Roman Catholic Church that we would know of, and less like the biblical concept of the church, we see the church working to shift the political landscape, I guess would be the best way to put that, to, in effect, commandeer both the rulers, so the kings, the nobility, what have you, but then also the armies of the kingdoms of Europe, and then use them to enforce the rule of the church, enforce the will of the church. This is, to me, most evident in how so many people across Europe, peasantry and nobility alike, were drawn to the idea of the Crusades, like moths to a flame, by the promises of the church of absolution of sin when fighting the Muslims, skipping purgatory as a reward for taking the Holy Land. Second, as the church in the West continues to assert its authority over the East, we begin to see the chain of events both theologically and politically. And this will ultimately, as we'll see, end with the East-West Schism in 1054, where the church split in two between West and East, and remains split to this day. While some cursory efforts have been made between the Pope and then the ecumenical patriarch of the Orthodox Church to, annul the anathemas and what have you, they're still split, and it's not likely they will ever reconcile. And then third, as the church in this time continues to grow in its wealth and its prestige, we see that it allows for the growth of what's called scholasticism, which is a movement of intense theological and philosophical growth that produces, for our purposes, some of the great minds in the history of the church, whether that's guys like Anselm of Canterbury or Boethius or Thomas Aquinas. And so this, combined with a broader movement across all of Europe, and really even more broadly than Europe, kind of Europe and then Western Asia, North Africa, maybe beyond that. A broader movement of greater artistic expression, and then also just deeper intellectualism across the board, results in what I call, because there's not really a great term for it, but what I call the first Renaissance, or the the early Renaissances, plural. And as we look at these things and we sort of peel back the layers of the movements, we'll really begin to see just how incorrect the label the Dark Ages is. So some of the things we see carrying over from the end of what's called classical antiquity, which I will add, if you think the Middle Ages is long, classical antiquity goes from the 8th century BC to the 6th century AD. And obviously it includes all the things we discussed in the first 500 years of the church. Some of the things that carried over from there were things like population decline across the empire, people moving away from the cities, fleeing the cities really to more rural areas, a collapse of the centralized authority that was Rome, the city of Rome, but then also Rome of the West. The invasions of the barbarian tribes, at least 3 of significance, but more than likely many more than that. And then also just mass migrations of tribes across Europe, and then also partly from Asia. So that's, you see the Goths, the various Germanic tribes, and then eventually you see the Huns come in from the Asian steppe into the Western Roman Empire. And so the traditional beginning of the Middle Ages, by how scholars date it, is 476 AD, when roughly after 100 years of pretty steady decline, civil war, and just not fighting back against the various barbarian invasions, the Western Roman Empire in 476 falls. By this time, nothing really is left of the power of the West. It doesn't have any military power. It doesn't have any economic power. Its once vast holdings have been taken over by new kingdoms of these various Germanic tribes. And as I said, the repeated invasions by the barbarians had really brought Rome to its knees. So in 476, the last Western Roman emperor is deposed, and the Western Senate sends the imperial insignia, the last emblem of Western Roman power, to the imperial court in the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. And so this marks the beginning of what's known as the early Middle Ages. What's left in the place of Rome in the West are the barbarian kingdoms. So these are the kingdoms that will eventually become the most powerful empires and nations of Europe. And then eventually from them will descend countries like France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, which obviously doesn't exist today. It was the predecessor to modern Germany, among others. But while the West had fallen, the East went on to become the most powerful economic, cultural, and military force in all of Europe. At its territorial height in the mid-500s under the Emperor Justinian, who we'll single out later in our study for the various things that he did, the East had fought the barbarian tribes and then recovered about 2/3 of the former territory of the West. If you can see the slide next to me, the big yellow block is the Eastern Roman Empire. Everything else to the west of that is the barbarian kingdoms that have thrown down the Western Roman Empire. And so even as we see the Eastern Roman Empire growing in power and prestige, a man is born in 570 in a town called Mecca in Arabia by the name of Muhammad. And Muhammad, as we know, goes on to found the religion of Islam. And he and his Muslim brethren spread like wildfire across the Middle East and North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula in southern Europe, so Portugal and Spain, and as far as India in the east, really even into southern France. And despite some of their earliest significant intellectual achievements, whether that be advances in medicine, science, philosophy, along with founding really great institutes of learning. What we somewhat unfortunately best know, the spread of Islam for today, is the violence that it produced against the peoples of Europe. And so you can see on this map here, in the orange, we start in Arabia. This is the beginning of the spread of Islam. From there, the yellow is within about 100 years of Islam's founding. And then you can eventually see how far up into Europe and then out east it gets. The blue is not Islamic, but if you didn't know it, believe it. There was a time for about 700 years or so where on and off Muslim caliphates owned Spain and Portugal. At that time, it was called Al-Andalus. And yeah, so this was the Muslim world up around the time of the coming of Charlemagne. Elsewhere in Europe during this time, you begin to see monasteries founded that really weren't just there so that a community of monks could, be in this place and come together in prayer and whatnot. They're really just there to Christianize the pagans. Whether they're in Germania or they're in the north in Scandinavia, the British Isles, what have you, they're there to Christianize the pagans. And when we talk about Charlemagne, we'll see terrible examples of what the unfortunate lengths to which some of the kings of Europe would go to Christianize the pagans. And as I mentioned with Charlemagne, the kingdom that comes to the forefront during this time was that of the Franks under Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire. And this is during the later 8th and early 9th centuries, covering much of Western Europe. We'll discuss the significance of Charlemagne and then his title of Holy Roman Emperor, being the first to hold that title. His significance to both Europe and then also to the church in both the West and the East. Eventually, the kingdoms of Europe began to succumb to the pressures of internal civil wars combined with external invasions, whether that was the Magyars of Hungary from the east, the Saracen Muslims from the south, and then most importantly, Vikings from the north. And we will actually talk more about the Vikings later as we progress, and I promise there are reasons to talk about the Vikings that do involve the church. I'm not just talking about the Vikings because the Vikings are cool. During the High Middle Ages then, which began after 1000, and I realize the slide hasn't flipped now. We're having tech issues. I apologize for that. During the High Middle Ages, which began around the year 1000, the population of Europe explodes, flourishes, as new technologies are developed, new agricultural innovations are developed. And then what's known as the medieval warm period happens. It's about 300-year stretch where just general temperatures, average temperatures across Europe go up a few degrees. Ironically, that's followed by the Little Ice Age, but you do see this, about a 300-year period of the medieval warm period. And this allows crop yields to increase dramatically. Two big things that you see come out of this are mannerism or manorialism, which is based around the manor, which this is the organization of peasants into villages that owed either rent or labor or usually both to certain noblemen or noblewomen. And then you have feudalism, if you've heard of feudalism, whereby knights and then lower status nobles would owe military service to the lords that were over them in return for the right to rent land and then manors from that overlord. So these were the two of the ways that society became organized during the High Middle Ages, so the middle part of our age here. And then we come to the Crusades. The Crusades first come about in 1095. These were military attempts by Western European Christians, mostly, to regain control of the Holy Land from Muslims. And we'll discuss the Crusades at length, as far as why they happened, and then more specifically, what exactly happened during the various Crusades. Because, we think of the Crusades and we'll think of one or two of them, but there were 9, at least, just involving the Holy Land. That doesn't even count the Crusades in Europe. So there were at least over a dozen Crusades in total during this period of time. We also see during this time that kings, they do become the heads of these sort of centralized nation states or kingdoms, which is great because this reduces crime and violence, but it's bad in a way because it makes the ideal of sort of a unified Christendom much more difficult to achieve. And when you have this competing with the agendas of all of these different kings and noblemen across Europe who all want different things, it makes a unified church much more difficult to achieve. So we'll also touch, as I hinted at the beginning, on some of the intellectual movements and what I said were the first renaissances, quote unquote, that started under Charlemagne in the 800s and then contributed to all of European society all the way into the early 1300s. Intellectual life at this time was marked by scholasticism. And scholasticism really is known for attempting to join faith and reason together. And then also you see the founding of universities, some of which still exist today. Oxford and Cambridge are great examples of this that still exists today. We'll look at how Christian philosophy really emerges and comes into its own and then sets the footing for ideas and philosophy that we still see today, whether that's secular or Christian. We use these things. Secular thinkers use these things. And then as we come into the 1300s, into the late Middle Ages, this is a time that's marked by what's known as the crisis of the late Middle Ages, which was a seemingly unending, divinely orchestrated set of disasters that included widespread famine, plague, war, which significantly diminished the population of Europe. So between 1347 and 1350, 3 years, the bubonic plague, which we know as the Black Death, killed about a third of all the people in Europe. 3 years, a third of the people in Europe dead. We also see various theological, political controversies come out from the various kingdoms and then from the church itself. We see the papal schism within the Catholic Church where we have a time when for about 40 years or so, the church in the West had as many as 3 different men at any given time claiming to be the Pope. And then when they would take their seat, they excommunicated the other 2. And so all of this strife, particularly within the Catholic Church, as it paralleled the international conflict, the civil strife, the peasant revolts, which were everywhere at the time, we see how it helps to mark the kingdoms of Europe at this time and how it eventually feeds in to what makes the Protestant Reformation happen. And so all of these things, especially the crisis of the late Middle Ages, serve to set the grand stage for the Protestant Reformation. The things that Luther was protesting against when he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg in 1517, these things come into being as a result of events that take place in the Middle Ages. The decline of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and then the eventual fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 are direct results of the Fourth Crusade. In my opinion, the worst of the Crusades, and we will talk about it, which happened in the Middle Ages. The reasons behind why nearly all of the countries of the Middle East are Muslim majority countries, and then also why a far flung from that area place like Indonesia is today the largest Muslim majority nation in the world. These things come out of the Middle Ages. The things that contributed even to the Enlightenment, which it starts out as just humanism and then eventually becomes secular humanism and then eventually irreligious entirely between the 16th and the 19th centuries. This comes out of what starts with scholasticism. What we see starting as a good thing in the church with scholasticism becomes the Enlightenment eventually after the Protestant Reformation begins. And this starts in the Middle Ages. And so it can be easy to dismiss the Middle Ages because we've been told through all of our educational upbringing and then all of these various History Channel documentaries or what have you, that the Middle Ages were a backwards time where the church uses the pretense of God's favor to justify slaughter. Society was idiotic. Everyone was idiotic and ignorant, and everyone had stupid ideas. The Black Death killed everyone, so on and so forth. But to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, when it comes to the Middle Ages, is to dismiss 1,000 years of our history as the church. And then, at least more broadly historically, to ignore so many things about the modern era that were brought about by events and people during this time. So, if nothing else, let's stick with this to wring out as much knowledge as we can, sort of like a sponge, from this era so that we can know why things happened as they did in the centuries that came after them. You'll see that we did not take a break. This is because this was an overview, and I expected it to be much shorter than the regular hour. So we will wrap here. The next time we'll meet will be in 3 weeks on January 5th, just so that hopefully you have time to or have the ability to safely, fully enjoy Christmas and New Year's with your family over the next couple of weeks, and then we'll pick up going back into the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And then before we close, I would ask for prayer for myself and then my family. Next Wednesday, the 23rd, I'll be undergoing gastric bypass surgery. I very obviously need it, and I felt that this was the best way to really take control of my health. So everything in my life is going to be different after this procedure. And even in just the brief time between next Wednesday and then January 5th, I'll likely have lost quite a bit of weight. So I would appreciate prayer that everything would go smoothly, and that I'd make it through. And so we'll see you next week. We'll see you next month.